Hello, everyone. My name is Kristen Harmon. I'm honored to be here today. I thank you all for having me here to talk about writing. First, I'd like to share a bit about myself. I am a professor at Gallaudet University in the English department, and I'm also a writer of both creative and scholarly works on a variety of topics, both fiction and nonfiction. So today, my presentation topic is Deaf Creative Writing, Past, Present, and Future. I could have incorporated this over all 3 days of the conference. I didn't realize it was spread over 3 days. But anyway, my primary focus, again, is on fiction and nonfiction. I know more about that type of writing compared to others. So if there's any poets here, you'll have to take the opportunity to explain more about poetry, because that's not my area. First, I would like to open with a question for all of you. Now, when I say deaf literature, what books come to mind for you? What do you think of when I say deaf lit? No, deaf lit. Specifically deaf. What books do you think of? What comes to mind? Okay, well, many people think of this. Pull it up here in the PowerPoint. Right? I'm sure many of you envisioned this book here. It was written in 1986 by a man named Douglas Bullard. And this is really called and referred to as the first deaf culture book. And the reason for that is it incorporates ASL gloss throughout the book. Many people envision this when you think of the first deaf culture book, but I would like to analyze that on a higher level. I'm sure you know the story. It's about a deaf man, and he's a government worker, and one day this idea comes to him that he'd like to set up a separate deaf state, their own community, owned by the deaf, for the deaf, that type of thing. And that's a fascinating concept, right? We see this throughout history. There have been many attempts to set up these separate deaf communities, but they have failed or dissolved over time. It's been a struggle. But really, it's an amazing concept, and people loved the idea of Islay. But many people who liked this concept haven't actually read the book. If you read the book, you'll understand there's some challenges. So going back to when it was first published, again, this was in 1986, and the Deaf Press did a review on the book. The reviews were very mixed. Some positive ones were this was the first attempt at incorporating ASL gloss in a book for the time. And there was some mixed responses about this concept. People were wondering how that would work, if it would be successful. Plus, this is the first attempt at showing Greater America what ASL gloss really looks like. And there were some negative reviews as well, as I had mentioned. For example, women and girls were very sexualized. They were sexual beings. Women were oppressed. And I feel like sometimes, especially now, in today's times, for example, the #MeToo movement, we have a different perspective on this. So looking at this piece from 1986, it was a different time. The men in the book are chasing the women. They're very objectified. So I just want to mention that. So objectification of women was not good, as well as there were no people of color in this book. There was maybe one hearing person of color, but that was all. So again, during the time, there was mixed reviews back in 1986. But we still call this book the first deaf culture book, so it's important for us to use this as a touch point to talk about issues before and after this novel. Now, Bullard himself was surprised about these mixed reviews because he said that this book was written in satire. It was meant to be ironic and satirical. That was his intention. But the Deaf Press referred to this as stereotyping. They thought that it was mocking the deaf community and their tendency to group people. So they thought, again, that this novel was stereotypical. But Bullard said that it was meant to be satire, so he was surprised when it wasn't well received. But that leads us to today's talk. Back then, and still now, people have this need for a hero. A deaf hero that reflects our work, our mission, our motivations, our passions. We don't want to have a goofy anti-hero. That's our goal, right? To have a hero to motivate people. This book had to be satirical. I'll explain why in a moment, but before this novel and after this novel just shows that this was really a touch point. It was a turning point in deaf literature. And it opens an important discussion about where we are today with deaf people in literature. Remember, that's our focus, fiction and nonfiction, not poetry so much. This book was reprinted in 2013 by the Gallaudet University Press, and it raises the question, why haven't there been more deaf culture novels? It's 2013, and we're reprinting this problematic book from 1986. So why are we reprinting this? Why haven't we had more books about deaf culture? I'd like to delve into considering the reasons why this is the case, as well as what we can do about it. Now I'd like to summarize what I plan to talk about today. We're going to be moving through time today. Again, there's 4 broad topics that relate to past and present time frames, starting with the 18th century. Most deaf characters that showed up in literature were created by hearing people. There weren't yet deaf writers or fiction writers. And I'd like to talk about what that shows about something called the hearing line in literature and how that influenced writers. Second topic is in the 1800s, post-World War II, as well as after the Milan Conference. There was a sense of the need to belong in the deaf community. This was spreading amongst deaf individuals everywhere. They wanted to focus on finding a deaf network or community, searching for a homeland or a deaf space. Now, the third topic, this is the late 1800s, early 1900s. We had a term come up called the deaf experience. This means, what are our values? What is important to us? This was represented in theater and in writing to explain the deaf experience. And then fourth, I'd like to talk about where we are today in deaf theater and deaf writers. And I'd like to speak about Commonwealth. There's more ideas, more strengths, more commonwealth amongst the deaf community. So that's the last thing I'll touch on. Now, I'd like to go back and start with the 1800s. So during the 1800s, you start to see more publications and writings about deaf characters in books, but these are written predominantly by hearing people. So deaf publishers and deaf people in general wanted to see representation of their authentic experiences in these stories, and a concern was raised, are these portrayals of deaf characters authentic, and do they accurately represent us? Now here you can see a quote from IVJ and the Silent Deaf Worker. They mention the concern about representation, and this dates back to 1848. Deaf writers in America, they wanted to have literature about deaf people, but they wanted to make sure that it was authentic and accurately represented deaf people in an appropriate manner. So this shows that something is lacking, obviously. There was a big stigma with deaf people. You see this often in literature, a divide. You have the angels. Angels are often connected with white people, women, pure virgins, very simple, elegant characters, as compared to outcasts. And this is often connected with women as well, but that are rude, rough, a very negative portrayal of characters, and they're loners, you pity them. You see these concepts come up in hearing literature, this big divide. Well, Krentz calls this the hearing line, that separation. And every moment, every word, every gesture, every interaction, this is influenced by the hearing line. Now, this concept is borrowed from W.E.B. Du Bois about something called the color line, how that influences literature based on separation of color. So this is what we often see in hearing literature with English compared to deaf people, and deaf people trying to figure out where they fit into an English world, that separation of hearing and deaf. But it's interesting, prior to this time, there were deaf characters in hearing literature who used sign language and finger spelling. It wasn't until after the late 1800s that it became more of an emphasis on oralism and proficiency with English. That came later. So it's interesting to see that differential in late 1800s. Now I'd like to shift to the second topic here. The Little Paper Family, or LPF, became a key network for deaf readers and writers. They wanted to spread these deaf publications to people. It started as a school newspaper about deaf education type things, and it began in 1848 all the way up to World War II, and it just really took off. But again, this was a network for deaf writers to come together. They no longer had to try to connect with the hearing literature world. They had their own network and could connect with other deaf writers and share their works with each other. This often emphasized deaf community. They didn't use exactly that word, but deaf connection, deaf togetherness, deaf space, or deaf colonies. That word comes up frequently, colonies. But it just emphasized how cherished deaf culture is. And there's two writers I'd like to share with today. You can see two publications up here. The one author is a deaf-blind author, and this book actually wasn't published until much later after he wrote it, but this was written back in 1948, and this is about a deaf hero. So this character went to Gallaudet University during that time and was meeting other deaf people that he became close friends with. And they decide to venture off campus and travel together. They travel west. And you see along the way they find different deaf colonies and find these deaf groups and then carry on to go to other places. So you see this incorporation of deaf spaces in his writing. The hero's name in the book is Mickey. Now, Mickey falls in love with a deaf woman who happens to be oral, and her father is a eugenicist. Obviously, because you need a plot twist in the book, right? So anyway, he meets this woman, they fall in love, but during this time, deaf people could not marry other deaf people. It was forbidden. But there is a happy ending to the story. So that's one piece I'd like to talk about. And then the other one is by a woman named Julia. This is a short story, a series of short stories rather. But it's really interesting to see how her stories link together. They're all based on a deaf boarding house that later becomes this deaf community or deaf colony, a home for deaf people to come together, a safe space to be yourself in, especially during all of these societal pressures of the time. To have this deaf colony, this deaf space was so important. provide security and protection. So those are two good examples of deaf literature. But during this time, publications were really focused on conventional English. There wasn't a lot of room for experimenting and playing with ASL and writing, because remember, during this time, you wanted to prove that you had good English. You wanted to show society that you were able to write English. There was a little bit of experimentation with, deaf humor and gestures, but primarily where we do see this is in the banners, as you can see here on the silent worker on the screen here. A woman named Pamela Kincheloe, she's a deaf scholar here at RIT, she actually published an article on that topic. It shows how fingerspelling is incorporated in these visual arts. So while we don't see it in the writing, you do see evidence of this in the art forms of the writings. Now I'd like to shift to my third topic, but first I want to mention there was an important event that happened on May 10th, 1942. Do any of you know what that was? May 10th, 1942? This was an important moment and really a milestone with deaf literature as we know it. So deaf literature has its roots in theater, as we know, and on May 10th, 1942, Gallaudet University students traveled to perform a show on Broadway of Arsenic and Old Lace. And that was the first time the group really had to think about the audience, because it was a hearing audience. This play was in sign language, and they realized it was important to have a script. But they weren't sure how to make this script. So one of the lead actors, Eric Malzkuhn, he later considered this and wrote an article about his experiences. It's in the Gallaudet archives. But again, it really made people think about how they can incorporate ASL into a script. How can we show the authenticity of the characters, their psychology? They wanted to really match the signs and the characters and their true selves with an appropriate translation, because it's not just a word-to-word translation. So this was a huge feat for all involved. They were trying to figure out how to incorporate English and ASL and bring them together to fit the hearing audience. This was an important moment, figuring out the marriage between ASL and English. Now on the next slide, I want you all to think about how this process spilled over into rethinking English literary forms for deaf lives. There was still this hearing line that needed to be faced. So I'm going to show you a paragraph from that same man, Eric Malzkuhn, and he talks about this hearing line and how to cross this line. Deaf authors during this time, we're now shifting to the 1950s, they started to think, who am I writing for? Where will this be published? What audience do I need to match? And this posed a challenge. Well, at the same time, another gentleman, Robert Panera, actually this theater is named in his honor, Panera Theater, right? He was thinking a lot about this issue. Deaf writers, they had this challenge. They wanted to write for hearing people, and they needed to prove that they could write as well as hearing people. They had to match the words of the hearing and prove that they could do this. It's an interesting concept. So during the 1950s, Panera gathered different works from deaf authors and reviewed them, and he realized that in many articles in the Silent Worker, for example, during this time, they would incorporate the dialect of English-speaking people. They would use phonetic spelling. And this was done by many writers, not just in a few publications. This can be seen in the Buff and Blue, Gallaudet's publication, but over and over you would see deaf writers using this dialect and this phonetic spelling of words. It was almost as if it was transcribed from a hearing person. So it's very interesting that that comes up often in works from deaf authors. So again, you see this challenge trying to match the hearing world. I'd like to expand a bit more about Robert Panera because he is an important figure that really contributes to this discussion. Now, Robert Panera, when he was at Gallaudet University, he helped with one of the plays that they put on called Oedipus. And during that, he thought about the translation process and actually wrote an article about that process. Now, this is a quote from his article. He actually says that in regards to sign selection, it shows the thingness of things. And the essence, the thingness of things. That's what the article said. So he's really talking about incontinuity. And this is before the one book was published about this. He wrote this in 1957, and he speaks of the incontinuity with signs and sign selection. So it's really very interesting. Panera was very much so ahead of his time. We'll have to cover these topics briefly for the sake of time, but throughout literature, whether it be in the Silent Muse or actually many stories, other publications, Buff and Blue, etc., many of these works open with a yell or a call, an auditory cue. That's the first line, and you see this happen over and over again. I'll give you an example. One story called Crime Cracker, solving crimes. The first line in that says, "I heard you." And you see this happen again and again. And that's not like phonetic spelling. This is a different concept. So this theory really looks at something called interpolation. This shows the ideology of oppression, power, in relation to deaf and hearing people. So that's why in this first scene, this first frame, there would be an auditory cue. During this time, deaf writers were trying to figure out how to connect with the hearing audience and how to catch their attention. So this auditory yell or call, this matched the hearing ideology. Their perspective was that of hearing culture. You had to think about how to incorporate hearing culture. So deaf characters really were embedded in this hearing ideology. It's a very interesting concept. Panera did go on to write and publish very important articles, but there's two takeaways I'd like to leave you with today. The National Theater of the Deaf was a pivotal moment for deaf creative arts. It really has influenced all aspects of deaf creative arts. And second, the deaf experience should be incorporated into English curriculum. We should have the thoughts of deaf people and their experiences involved and incorporated with English curriculum. So those are two important takeaways that I want to leave with you today. Now, Sign Me Alice is a rewriting of the famous play called Pygmalion, which was then made into a movie called My Fair Lady. I'm sure you all know the story. Obviously, there's a lot of parallels with oralism. I don't have time to review the whole plot, but this was the first time that an ASL publication used English. So as you can see in the theater, there was a lot of translation before the book Islay was written. I'm sorry, but I do need to jump to my fourth point in the sake of time. But the point of all of this is that there's an overlap, an extension. There has to be. There's many parallels with deaf norms and hearing culture. Deaf people throughout history have to break down this hearing paradigm in everything that they do. My fourth point is Commonwealth. That's where we are today. One scholar said that the problem with deaf writings is dialogue. Edna Edith Sayers had said that the reason we don't have more deaf culture books is the problem of dialogue. But we do. We have these 3 books. We have many more, actually. You have many instances where sign overlaps with written English. So it's not for lack of a commonwealth of ideas. I do need to wrap up now. But if you'd like to meet after with any questions, to chat more about this presentation, clarify anything I said, please feel free to come up and I would be happy to chat with all of you. Thank you so much for your time.